reality of caste, she says, is what gives it its power and longevity. Gunnar Myrdal applied the term in 1944, so this isn't new. He wrote a 1,200-page study of race in 1944 that was funded by the Carnegie Corporation, and that book was called An American Dilemma. So Myrdal had used the term back in 1944. Then Wilkerson does a sort of long-term history of the emergence of caste in America. It says in 1619, the first Africans were brought to America by a Dutch man of war. There was only one colony then in Virginia, and those Africans, I don't know how many there were, a small number, were not necessarily slaves yet, but they had a debased status. Slavery was known all over the world, of course. It was already practiced in the New World, but it was emerging as a system. In 1630, it said the census didn't bother to record Africans who lived in Virginia by name, age, or arrival date, as it did for indentured servants, European servants. Can you all hear me, by the way? Is this working out? I'm not getting any feedback, so.
On Zoom, yes. Unknown on the church.
I don't know about the church, right? So I'll just keep going because I don't know. Anyway, so they were already treated differently. They were not recorded really as people. And at first, it was their status by religion that confirmed their low caste status, because for centuries, although slavery existed in Europe and the Middle East and Africa and so forth, the rule was that you couldn't enslave co-religionists. That is, Christians could enslave Muslims and Muslims could enslave Christians, but they couldn't enslave those from their own religion. But then the Africans who arrived in Virginia started converting, so that threatened the hierarchy. But then their immunity to European diseases compared to the indigenous folks that the Virginians were already enslaving meant that they were a better source of free labor than the natives. And the natives and the Virginians were determined that they wanted slaves of some sort. So attention turned to their birthmarks, which was their skin color. And it began to codify as black versus white. So Wilkerson makes the point that no European is white and no African is black. Those categories don't mean anything in Europe and in Africa, or at least didn't originally. My grandfather, when he was telling my cousin very, very seriously that she must promise him that she would never marry a Swede, was thinking in European terms. But later in his life, he was a Norwegian immigrant, and later in his life, when he used the N-word in Florida, he was thinking more in American terms. So groups came to whiteness slowly. Who was white originally in the Americas? Well, Franklin essentially questioned whether the Germans were, because he thought they were not useful people. They were dangerous to Anglo-Saxon hegemony in Pennsylvania. Later, the Irish and others, probably Norwegians for that matter, I was not sure those were white because they weren't really part of the in-group. But gradually whiteness evolved and widened. America decided it needed definitions of race to codify caste, because was developing into a real caste system. The core of the book, Wilkerson defines 8 pillars of caste. The first is divine sanction and the laws of nature. In India, there were the laws of Manu, I guess, in the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. In the US, there was the curse of Ham that went back to the Old Testament. This was a story I didn't even know. The story was that Noah, before or after the ark, who knows, was drunk and lay naked in his tent. And his sons, there were 3 of them, who became all the people who populated the earth afterward. His son Ham discovered him in his tent, and he told his brothers that his dad was drunk and naked lying in his tent. So the brothers went in there and they covered him up. Then when Naked heard that Ham had seen him naked in his tent, he cursed him. And then the 3 sons, Shem's descendants, spread to the east, Ham's to the south, that is to Africa, and Japheth's to the west, presumably to Europe. So this story, which is one of these crazy random biblical stories, which seems to mean absolutely nothing, was entered into a history that justified slavery, because the sons of Ham had been cursed by Noah, and so they got to be slaves, presumably. So the church in the South put Black folk at the lowest end of the great chain of being, running from the king and the Pope, presumably, all the way down to the lowest people, those being slaves. So the first pillar was divine sanction. The second pillar was heritability. In India, the caste system was an occupational system, and it was inherited from the father. Those jatis, they were called, were occupational groups. In Virginia, the Virginians deliberately broke with English legal precedent to say that caste was inherited from the mother. This had no foundation in British law, but it was useful for making it possible for masters to rape their slaves and create more slaves and create more profitability. So it was inheritable through the mother. The third pillar was endogamy and control of marriage and mating. In India, Bhimrao Ambedkar, who was a Dalit activist who wanted to end the caste system. He was in the early 20th century, and he had quite a role in the early 20th century in breaking down the caste system. He was born into the lowest caste as one of those untouchables. He said, caste means an artificial chopping off of the population into fixed and deliberate definite units, each one prevented from fusing into another through the custom of endogamy. Caste discrimination is now outlawed, but it can be guessed through surnames. In Virginia, men could rape Black women, but starting in 1630, they were prosecuted for consensual sexual relations. The slaves in that year were made to watch as one white man who had gotten together with a Black woman was whipped for violating this prohibition. So that's where the miscegenation laws began. And those laws were not overturned until 1967, and often still kept on the books even longer. And those miscegenation laws, in fact, were the cause of the majority suspicion of such groupings, Black and white together, were the cause of most lynchings in the US. The fourth pillar was purity versus pollution. In India, there was untouchability. The lowest caste people had to wear bells announcing that they were coming, sometimes wipe out their footprints as they walked along, sometimes prostrate themselves in the presence of a Brahmin because their presence was somehow polluting. And that was common in caste things. In Germany, the Jews were prevented from swimming at their own summer homes and at public beaches because they were defined, again, as polluting. In the U.S., the separate versus equal rules of the South, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case arose when Plessy, a man defined as Black, but who looked white, bought a first-class railroad ticket. And he was prosecuted because his presence, presumably, in the first-class car was polluting to all the other riders. That, of course, began 60-some years of separate but equal in the law. In the South, there were separate Bibles for Blacks and whites to swear on in court. And of course, we know there were many U.S. public pools that were swimming pools that were built in the 30s and 40s that were opened and were open to whites in the 30s and 40s and enjoyed by many people. And when the rules started to change and they said, well, you have to admit Blacks to these pools, many of them were closed and filled with concrete rather than being integrated. It's just hard to imagine this degree of sense of pollution that came out of the caste system, but there it was. There were other parts of the caste system that were beginning to emerge as well. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the 1924 Immigration Act, the Gentleman's Agreement of the early 1920s that tried to keep Japanese out. All of these trying to keep those who were defined as non-white out of the U.S. because they were defined as undesirables. Then what do you do with the people in between? This is kind of an interesting question. Wilkerson says that what you do with the people in between the castes, Black and white, depends on politics. In Germany, the Germans were working on their racial laws in the 1930s after Hitler was elected. And they looked to the U.S. eugenics movement of the early 20th century for their inspiration about what they should do. The German word Untermensch, or subhuman, went into German from the book title of a New England-born eugenicist, Lothrop Stoddard. His book in 1922 was The Revolt Against Civilization, the Menace of the Underman. And that became a standard text in German schools. In 1934, then, German scholars were studying U.S. laws to frame their laws. After all, the U.S. was the leading racist jurisdiction. And most states in the U.S. demanded that race be put on birth certificates. The one thing they had difficulty with was why U.S. laws had nothing to do with Jews. It seemed to be a blind spot in the U.S. racial system. But anyway, they studied the U.S. laws, but they really had a hard time with the miscegenation laws. They had a hard time believing that most states actually enforced these strict miscegenation laws. They tried to make sense of the U.S. fraction system. No one thought the one-drop rule made any sense. One-drop rule, or, as it was variously across the states, some states were a quarter Black, some were 1/8 Black, a 32nd Black, all of that kind of thing. This would exclude too many people who were mostly Aryan. And that was a bridge a little bit too far for the Germans. In the end, they defined a Jew as a person with 3 Jewish grandparents, and separately counted as Jewish anyone descended as from 2 Jewish grandparents and who practiced Judaism, or who was accepted into the Jewish community or was married to a Jew. In South Africa, South African whites had an incentive to grow their power and numbers by granting honorary whiteness to those close enough. So they grew categories of colors that were in between black and white, but there was no such incentive in the US. Now, I don't know much about the South African system. I understand that there were lots of different varieties. I'm colored, and that didn't necessarily mean they were between black and white, but there were other groups. But this is what Wilkerson says, anyway. Oregon defined as non-white any person who had 1/4 Negro, Chinese, or Kanaka, which I understand is Hawaiian blood, or more than 1/2 Indian blood. Then the 5th category of caste in Wilkerson's system is occupational hierarchy. The Indian jati systems established your occupation. The lowest jatis were tanners or morticians. There was, it's not well known, but in Japan, there was also a caste system. And the lowest castes in Japan were the burakumin, which means villagers. And they were butchers, leather workers, and morticians. The butchers and leather workers were occupational groups that presumably didn't follow Buddhist precepts of kindness to animals. And the morticians were people who violated Shinto senses of purity, because dead bodies were considered impure. As elsewhere, these were enforced by endogamy. And 50 years ago, when I heard about this system, we learned that these occupational categories, which produced untouchables, had migrated to the US. And just as in India and other caste systems, this would come out when you were looking, it was endogamy. It was when you were looking for a marriage partner, and people would investigate the family background of the people involved. So in the US, after slavery, in many places, most of the low caste folks were restricted to being sharecroppers or servants, domestics, lawn boys, chauffeurs, janitors, or entertainers. In South Carolina, this was restricted by law. Also, then, it happened that these occupations, when the Social Security system came in, were the ones not covered by Social Security. So this was one of those things that kind of reinforced things to go on later. The 6th pillar was dehumanization and stigma. In Germany, there were the death camps and medical experimentation. In the US, there were the slave labor camps, the so-called plantations, and medical experimentation. The 7th pillar was terror as enforcement and cruelty as a means of control. And this was very similar, really, in the US and in Nazi Germany. It also happens in other systems, in wars and so forth, where groups are seen as subhuman. The 8th pillar was inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority. In India, clothing was regulated by sumptuary laws, that is, laws that says what kind of clothes you can wear depending on what group you're in. And Wilkerson says that in the U.S., often people of the lowest caste always had to be careful not to show any kind of threat to the assumed pecking order. Wilkerson's book is full of personal stories. That's the best part of the book, rather than the stuff that I've been talking about. But she talks about some of her own encounters with caste. She talks about, I think, doing research for her first book, which was about the Great Migration northward. And she talks about going to somebody in somewhere in the Miracle Mile in Chicago to interview them for her book. She arrives in the office and her interviewee is not there, and then he arrives and he's in a great hurry, and she introduces herself, and he says, well, he has no time to talk to her because he has an appointment with somebody that he's interviewing, somebody from the New York Times. She says, well, I'm the person who your appointment is with. He said, well, do you have a card? Prove it. She said, well, I've already interviewed a whole bunch of people today, and I've kind of run out of my New York Times cards. I can show you my driver's license. He says, yeah, but that doesn't prove you're with the New York Times. He refused to talk to her. She just didn't look like the person he was expecting to see. And then she talked about flying from Chicago to Detroit, getting into the Detroit airport. She's in a hurry. She doesn't have any baggage, so she's straight for the rental car place, and she's thinking carefully about how she's going to manage her day, having to drive into Detroit and having several interviews and so forth. And somebody, as she's trying to get on the rental car bus, two people start tailing her, and they start asking her questions. What's she doing in Detroit? What's her business? What's this all about? She said, well, she's just flown in from Chicago. She's on her way to, she's a reporter. She's writing a book. She's got a lot of work to do. And, what's their problem? They said, well, they're with the Drug Enforcement Agency. She needs to get on the rental car bus. And so I don't understand what your problem is. So she gets on there, and they follow her and watch her the whole time. So not knowing what else to do, she pulls out her pad and paper and starts taking notes on them, which eventually gets them to back off. But meanwhile, she's feeling like everybody on the bus is watching her and looking at her like she's some kind of felon. And there's just no reason for this. It's part of being a low caste person, or being seen as a low caste person. So she says, this is on page 183, if the lower caste person manages actually to rise above an upper caste person, the natural human response from someone weaned on their caste's inherent superiority is to perceive a threat to their existence, a heightened sense of unease, of displacement, of fear for their very survival. If the things that I have believed are not true, then I might not be who I thought I was. The disaffection is more than economic. The malaise is spiritual, psychological, emotional. Who are you if there is no one to be better than? So she's seeing this as more than economic, as a view of what your view is and what your place is in a total hierarchy of society. And she talks about a specific instance. In his book, Dying of Whiteness, author Metzel was told of the case of a 40-year-old white taxi driver who was suffering from an inflamed liver that threatened his life. Because the Tennessee legislature had neither taken up the Affordable Care Act nor expanded Medicare coverage, the man was not able to get the expensive, life-saving treatment that would have been available to him had he lived just across the border in Kentucky. As he approached death, he stood by the conviction that he did not want the government involved. No way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens, the man told Metzel. Ain't no way I'd support Obamacare or sign up for it. I would rather die. And sadly, so he would. So the question is, what keeps the caste hierarchy in place today? And what do we do about it? She calls for radical empathy, that we need to think about placing ourselves in the shoes of other people. That we always need to examine our own views and try to think about the artificial and subconscious views that we have inherited as a result of our upbringing. But she's not the only voice in all of this. There are others who say we need to work on empathy for low caste folks? Or do we really need to work on economic justice? Or both? So at this point, I'm not sure what to do. I have finished my presentation, and I think we've got a discussion going, and I can't see anybody in the sanctuary, so I don't know how this is going to work. Can't see or hear anybody in the sanctuary.
What you just said about economic justice versus empathy, I think they're the same thing. I mean, two views of the same thing. You know, you probably won't want to have empathy or social, excuse me, let me rephrase that, social justice if you don't have empathy for the people that are on the lower end and understand that they are also valuable people and also valuable citizens and have a lot to contribute.
I think that's true. I'm seeing some people are saying, let's work on this politically. That's not so much thinking about the personal empathy, but let's, like for John McWhorter says, basically we need to work on ending the drug war, making sure that there are jobs for people, that we get free vocational training for people, and things like that, and not focus so much on individual empathy, but we need to work on political solutions. So anyway, there are different approaches. I don't know what anybody else thinks here. I'm not seeing or hearing things except for other folks on Zoom.
Joanne, can you hear me? This is Judy Wyden in the sanctuary.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'll tell you that there are 20 of us in the sanctuary, kind of spread out, and if I hand the microphone to them, they can introduce themselves and then ask the question.
Okay.
Oh, there's more of you than I thought, too. So, Kathy?
Hi, this is Kathy Ayers. I just wanted to add, too, that not only have we done it with race and skin color, but we've also started doing the same thing with sexual orientation and other divisions in our society that people see as not typical. And I get really frustrated because I don't know how to fix it, but my thought is somehow we have to get people to understand that we are all human beings and kind of start at the base level, you know, just what color our skin is, what sexual orientation we are, what language we are. We're still all human beings that have the same feelings and processes in our head, and somehow finding a way to get that across to people who are so bigoted they can't see it.
Any others? Jean Ferguson.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It makes one sick at heart. and I don't know how to cure it. I do know that I was lucky because I was born into a family, white and even of German heritage. But I remember my father as a realtor in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He showed a home to some black people one day. And on a Father's Day afternoon, the phone rang, and I heard Dad say something like, "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way." And what had happened is he had shown a black family a home in Bloomington, Minnesota, suburb of Minneapolis. And he was told on the phone, "We know where you live. We know you have 3 daughters. You must be awful hungry to want to show a home to a nigger." And I guess where I'm going with that story is my dad, I remember hearing him say on the phone, "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way." I didn't know what he had heard until after the fact. But you know my dad? The next day, Monday, you know where he was? He was in the governor's office of Minnesota, reporting the incident and where it happened. And do you know what happened in that neighborhood on Tuesday? The governor's representative of affirmative action, who himself was very black, 6'2", he showed up in every door in that neighborhood in Bloomington. And he basically told everybody, "We hear there's a problem here. Anybody who wants to live anywhere, they get to. And if we hear the slightest sound of anything other than that, acceptance and inclusion, we'll take you in." And I only mention that story for a lot of reasons, because I was lucky. I was born into a family where, and here my dad, he was born in Canada, so maybe that has something to say about it, I don't know. All I know is I had that kind of an upbringing where everybody was everybody. Everybody was a friend, or they were a relative, they were a person. My mom, though, born in a West Virginia family, and when I joined VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, at 20 years of age, white middle-class Minneapolis girl, I was assigned to South Central Los Angeles. Highest crime rate, and the Black Panthers were drilling in the streets. But because of my father, I had, I never ever considered anything else other than I'm here to work, I'm here to enjoy and to be with everybody. And I'm sorry to take time on my own. It's just that had a great influence on me. And I guess I'm wondering, what happens in a person's brain and their heart? Where does that start? Is it just political, or is it just because of color of skin? What happens? Where were we taught to hate anybody?
I think from our parents.
Well, I guess I was lucky. I remember my mother, she was so afraid. She said, "Jeannie, you can't work." I said, "Mommy, I'll be fine." But does anybody have an idea how, and I guess it's up to us who are in the younger generations to teach the upcoming generations about loving your neighbor as you love yourself, even loving your enemies, which Christ told us to do. So I'm sorry to preach on there. I just have such strong feelings of sadness that this can go on, and of the people who can let it go on. What do we do? What can we do more specifically? I think America has come a long way, I think, when I think of some of the laws today. I could be wrong, because I don't follow my school lessons that closely. I'm sorry, can anybody offer an opportunity? How can we break the hate?
Yes, I can. Sorry, this is Kathy again. I think we have to put ourselves out there. I know my sister and I joined LGBTQ disability choir. And after we joined, I said, should we do this? Because I don't want to take away from what we're trying to build for these people. but we were told they needed all the allies they could get. So we sing in it. And, I think that that's a lot of it, is just showing people that there is another way and we don't get injured by it or have any problems with it.
I don't think you can change. Well, you can. I'm Jane. Excuse me. I think we've come a long way as far as the laws go and what can happen. Okay, what can happen. But I think laws don't change people's hearts. And that starts in the family, and it starts with the culture. As a teacher, I used to watch black and white kids, or I lived in Eastern Oregon, Native American kids, be really good friends on the playground and in class until they were about 5th or 6th grade. And then, especially when we went to middle school, that totally changed. And they're getting that picture and that idea from our society. You can look at the problem with banning books today, or what should be taught in the schools today. And I try to talk to people, and they say, well, I didn't cause slavery. That wasn't my fault. And I think we really need to talk a lot more about what's happening today and making a point of that. But we've come a ways. But I think, personally, I think people don't believe in faith anymore. And I learned some of that through my schooling and then through my parents. But we have to stand up to these people who want to ban all these books. And, I was a history teacher, and I taught a unit on racism in America. And you have to be very careful with kids that age. But we got them to thinking about what that would be like. And they argued with me one day about now they all have to put their backpacks down when they go into 7-Eleven because the owners feel they're going to steal something. And my white kids didn't like that. And I said, well, that happens to black and brown kids all the time. A good percentage of their lives. And so if you can relate, how do you feel? And then how would somebody else feel? We're just a hard-hearted nation, I think. And it has to do with power and profit and privilege, which is very, very sad in our country. But there was some part of this, and I said that's like what's going on in the world today with the Lebanese and the Israel problem and in the Ukraine, So it's just difficult. But I think we can all, each of us, do something. Say that's rude or that's not right, or I wish you could feel differently about how you act and how you talk.
Joanne, do you want to respond? Your face is here, so I assumed you might be having a comment.
No, I don't have anything particular.
Anyone else here?
Listening.
Can I say something? I'm not.
Sure,
Yes.
Warren.
Can you hear me?
Your wife says you can say something.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Whew. That's good. In my experience, I think what happens is an absolute lack of empathy. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people of my so-called race and suggested that what they saw as irrational was a reasonable response to the life experiences of minority people. They'd say, oh, well, I think this person or this event is actually helpful, and yet these minority people are questioning that. And I said, well, how many times do you think that minorities have been told, well, this is not racist, this is actually to help you, when the absolute opposite was true? That has happened so much, and so more than it hasn't happened, I think that's a natural reaction. And it's not that, well, why can't these people see that I'm being benign? This is their experience of people who look like us, me and the person I was talking to. That's all.
Thank you. Other comments? Have I become the moderator? Yeah, I think. I'm
You're
going
in a better position to do it than I am because I'm not seeing anything.
isn't that strange?
Yeah.
So I have one comment. When we were talking about different categories of caste, and I think it's interesting that economics is one. And I was listening to something on OPB radio, one of my frequent things that I listen to, where they had a pediatric neurologist who was talking about the formation of neurons in the brains of young children. And one of the big indicators of whether there was going to be a lot of brain growth or less brain growth was economics. And there's lots of different facets to that. You know, you have nutrition, of course, and you have parental education levels and how they are talking to their child, and are they reading to their child? I think a lot about, because a lot of the people that I deal with in the clinic are Latino. I think a lot about them and whether they know how to read in their own language, much less in English, and how that affects the brains of their children. If they don't know how to read and they don't know how, or presumably a lot of them can tell stories even if they can't read, but that's a big part of being a child, is listening to stories and learning from stories and thinking about things and thinking about what was the lesson from that story, or was there one, or was, and I just think about that as being, something that I loved it when my mother read to me. And I loved it when I read to my granddaughter, Rachel, and she learned how to read very early, 4, basically just from listening and, learning from me. Her mother didn't read to her much, but basically she didn't have time. So I just think of those things and how they tend to become cyclical, and it's hard to break out of that because, it's hard to get somewhere if you don't have the means. Anyway, enough of that.
Alice Check is asking for the mic. I served on a citizen review board, which is a program to review cases of children in state custody. And I also worked with Somali Bantu little kids for several years. And I've felt that one time I read that in some European countries, they send visiting nurses to homes to see how newborn babies are doing. The kids in these disadvantaged homes are behind when they start school, and it's kind of difficult to get them caught up. And plus, a lot of them apparently develop ADHD and so forth from neglect. I have felt that the U.S. should send nurses to Black and white homes and identify
children at risk and then offer services of things like drug and alcohol treatment, parenting classes, teaching them to read to their children, the importance of limiting screen time and all these kinds of things, and maybe the kids wouldn't get so far behind.
It is actually starting to happen that there are not necessarily nurses, but social workers with medical backgrounds going to homes of and following families, following moms and their children from birth to, like, I think it's 24 months, to just kind of check in with them. But this is just barely getting off the ground. It's been needed for a long, 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 long time.
I think that is a part of highly socialized medical system. I hate to use the term medical system, but the Scandinavian and Northern European systems often have included nurses that go.
Yeah, that's one of that makes me think, we're talking about early childhood care and education. But there's a huge crisis in childcare right now. Gotten worse. So we need to be putting more resources into this.
We're going to try to close up in 2 minutes, so I have one more time for maybe one more question. We've got Marie Mann here, and we'll let you finish it up.
My one question to everybody is, what does the role of social media have in all of this?
Wow, we close on a huge one, I think. Joanne, I'm so impressed with your presentation. I expected it to be good, and it was even better than I expected. Thank you so much. We have happy people here that are applauding, and I'm sure the Zoom, I think I see some Zoom applause too. We'll continue some of this conversation ourselves as we go out. Thank you so much. Yeah, how are you feeling?
Me? I'm doing okay.
Okay.
This is the day I've started to feel like, oh, I'm coming back to being human.
Good, thank you very much. You are human.